There is more reason to be skeptical of a flood geology interpretation of the Bible. Flood geology proponents often cite the Bible's testimony that the flood encompassed, quote, all the earth, to account for the worldwide distribution of fossils and the pan-continental observations of certain geological phenomena.
There are some people who say that that record is about a local flood.
I believe it's a global flood, and all the high hills, or the whole heaven, were covered, a universal statement.
And the flood, is it a global flood? Well, I mean, I don't know how many times, I think 35 times or so, the word kol, which is all, occurs in the flood narrative.
This statement is misleading. The word kol, or all, does occur frequently in the flood narrative. However, the phrase kol eretz, all the earth, or all the land, occurs only once, in Genesis chapter 8, verse 9, to describe the extent of the floodwaters. When we are talking about the scope of the flood, a proper understanding of this phrase is the governor for the other references to kol, all, in the narrative. Many people instinctively understand all the earth to mean the whole planet.
If we read the account of the flood here to the studio audience, the highest hills under the whole of heaven, the highest and the whole of heaven, and how the water rose and so on, and God put a rainbow in the sky at the end as a sign he would never repeat such an event again.
It couldn't have been
We've had lots of local floods.
What I would do with an audience...
The word all, can be used in different ways. We even say that today. I might say, well, I think all the people in such and such a town, are this or that, and you don't really mean all. But the difference is here, and the waters prevailed exceedingly on the earth, and all the high hills under, and then there's another all, it's the same words translated here, whole, but all the high hills under, all the heaven were covered. The waters prevailed 15 cubits upwards. In other words, you got them above the mountains. The mountains are covered. A local flood, the water's not going to stand there for months, as the water goes down. Besides which, when the ark landed, Noah had to wait, 70 days before even other mountaintops were seen. I mean, this was a massive flood.
There is another passage of Genesis that uses this phrase that can help us understand its reference. Genesis chapter 41 describes another of the foundational events of the Old Testament narrative, the 7-year famine in Egypt during the life of Joseph. Verses 56 and 57 describe the famine's scope and the amount of people that it affected. Quote, when the famine was spread over all the face of the earth, then Joseph opened all the storehouses and sold to the Egyptians, and the famine was severe in the land of Egypt. The people of all the earth came to Egypt to buy grain from Joseph, because the famine was severe in all the earth. The phrase all the earth in verse 57 is the same as in Genesis chapter 8, verse 9. It is reinforced in verse 56 with the phrase all the face of the earth. Keep in mind that this is still a part of the same book, written by the same author, Moses, at the same time and in the same literary style. This means that we have every reason to believe that Moses is using this phrase to mean the same thing in both verses. Thus, if Genesis chapter 8 verse 9 means that the flood affected the whole planet, then Genesis 41 verse 57 means that Joseph's famine also affected the whole planet. The extension of this would be that, quote, the people of all the earth would mean that people from China, Australia, Europe, and the Americas came to Egypt to buy grain because they were victims of the same famine. Except, nobody interprets Joseph's famine in this way. With respect to Genesis chapter 41, it is recognized that Moses is speaking with reference to the known world of his people, the Hebrews, in his day, approximately 1400 BC. Moses did not know about China, Australia, Europe, or the Americas. It would be anachronistic to read these regions of the world into a statement made by a man who did not know any of these places existed. The result is that, in spite of the language he uses, we understand Moses is speaking of a regional event that affected Egypt and the surrounding nations, Canaan, Jordan, Syria, Libya, and maybe into Mesopotamia and the wider Mediterranean. Even Answers in Genesis takes this understanding. Quote, most likely the famine was multi-regional, spreading from Egypt and outward over the Mediterranean basin, end quote. But if we accept that Moses' use of the phrase kol eretz, all the earth, despite its appearance, is contextually understood to mean a regional area and not the entire planet as we know it today, does this mean that he is using this phrase in the same kind of way in Genesis chapter 8, verse 9? Is Genesis history appeals to other statements in the flood narrative to assert that Moses is using the phrase all the earth to speak of the whole planet?
There are some people who say that that record is about a local flood.
I believe it's a global flood, and all the high hills are the whole heaven were covered, a universal statement.
Appeal to this statement begs the question, if, quote, all the mountains implies the whole planet in the flood narrative, then why doesn't, quote, all the face of the earth imply the same in the famine narrative? Why is it that we accept Genesis 41:56 as a contextual statement, whereas we take Genesis 7:19 as an absolute one? Again, these passages are part of the same book, written by the same author at the same time in the same literary style. It is inconsistent to interpret these references in different ways, and there is no exegetical precedent to do so. If, quote, all the face of the earth can be contextualized to the nations and peoples of a specific region because that's all Moses and the Hebrews knew about, then the same can be done for the phrase, quote, all the high mountains everywhere under the heavens. It is just as legitimate of a reading to understand that Moses is speaking of all the mountains that he and the Hebrews would have known about in the region of the world that they would have lived and traveled in.
If this is a judgment on mankind, then it has to be global.
Actually, no, it doesn't. Humans did not spread out to populate the earth until after the Tower of Babel. This event is recorded in Genesis chapter 11, some 2 chapters after the conclusion of the flood narrative. It is only in the wake of the flood that mankind is dispersed. Prior to the flood, mankind occupies a relatively small area. So, even with the flood coming as a judgment on all mankind, it would not have needed to encompass the entire planet to do so, because people were not living on the whole planet yet. The primary issue with respect to these references is what the biblical authors had in mind when they make references to, quote, all the earth and the like.
God's revelation to Israel needed to be culturally decipherable. They had to get it. They had to understand it. It also had to be culturally consistent. In other words, God couldn't fill the Old Testament with things that were foreign to the culture to whom he was communicating, or else they would go, what?
If we look across the rest of Scripture, there are other instances recorded that can help us properly understand them. In Deuteronomy chapter 2, verse 25, God says of the Israelites that, quote, I will begin to put the dread and fear of you upon the peoples everywhere under the heavens. No biblical scholar understands this phrase in the, quote, plain, literal sense, because this would create a whole host of interpretive problems. Nobody in East Asia, Europe, or the Americas were fearful of Moses and the Israelites, because none of those people ever heard of them, even though the plain, literal sense of the phrase, quote, everywhere under the heavens, would seem to indicate across the entire planet. A contextual understanding of the biblical world brings us to the proper interpretation. God is accommodating his words to the limits of the knowledge of the people receiving them. The world that they knew about was the ancient Near East. It was all of these people who they would interact with during the course of their history, and it was these people who God was intending to put fear into, because they would be the ones who could cause Israel to stumble or be destroyed. Isaiah chapter 37 records King Hezekiah's response to the impending invasion of Jerusalem by the Assyrians. Truly, O Lord, the kings of Assyria have devastated all the countries and their lands. As with Deuteronomy chapter 2, no biblical scholar understands this phrase in the, quote, plain, literal sense. Assyria did not conquer East Asia, Europe, or the Americas. The territory conquered by Assyria was that which was known to the people of Jerusalem at the time, the ancient Near East. Again, God is accommodating his words to the limits of the knowledge of the people receiving them. A similar occurrence is recorded in Jeremiah chapter 51, verse 25. God describes Babylon as, quote, O destroying mountain, who destroys the whole earth. Like Assyria, Babylon did not conquer East Asia, Europe, or the Americas either. This is another contextual reference to the whole of the ancient Near East, the world of the Old Testament's authors. We also see this understanding persisting into the New Testament. Luke chapter 2 verse 1 states that, quote, a decree went out from Caesar Augustus, that a census be taken of all the inhabited earth. This census did not include the people of East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or the Americas. All the inhabited earth is properly understood as referring to the whole of the Roman Empire, which for those underneath Rome's jurisdiction would have represented nearly the limits of the known world at the time. If we read Luke's words in the, quote, plain literal sense, what ends up happening is we actually create an error in the Bible, an error that, in reality, does not exist. Famously, in the record of Pentecost, Luke records that, quote, there were Jews living in Jerusalem, devout men from every nation under heaven. He then records a list of the nations whose languages were represented during the outpouring of the tongues of fire. This list of nations corresponds to the Table of Nations found within Genesis chapter 10, and it accounts for every people group known to the authors of the Bible. Luke is not intending to say that people from East Asia, the Americas, or Europe were represented at Pentecost. This idea would be anachronistic, because neither Luke nor any other Christian in the first century knew about these parts of the world. Luke later records in Acts chapter 11, quote, some prophets came down from Jerusalem to Antioch. One of them, named Agabus, stood up and began to indicate by the Spirit that there would certainly be a great famine all over the world, and this took place in the reign of Claudius. Just like Joseph's famine, the famine recorded in Acts needs to be understood contextually. Luke is not saying that the famine spread to East Asia, Sub-Saharan Africa, or the Americas, because he did not know about those places, and neither did anyone else in the New Testament. In Acts chapter 24, Luke records Paul's accuser Tertullius describing the apostle as, quote, a fellow who stirs up dissension among all the Jews throughout the world. Jews were not living all over the entire planet, but they were living all over the Roman Empire, of which Paul traveled in his ministry. Perhaps the best New Testament example is directly from Paul himself. In Colossians chapter 1, verse 23, he describes, quote, the gospel that you have heard, which was proclaimed in all creation under heaven. If these words are to be understood in their, quote, plain, literal sense, then Paul is wrong, because we recognize today that there are still unreached people groups in the world. However, if we allow for Paul to be speaking contextually, from his own perspective as a Roman Jewish convert living during the first century, we recognize that he is speaking of the Roman world, not the entire planet. In all of these references, the language to quote all the earth and like phrases are not meant in the modern, literal sense of the whole planet. They are each properly understood as being contextualized to the individual who said them and to the people who originally heard them. This then begs the question, given this understanding across the rest of the Bible, why can't the same understanding be credited to the reference to the flood encompassing, quote, all the earth? Whether you believe the flood was across the whole planet or was regionally specific to the ancient Near East, there is biblical precedent for either interpretation, precedent that doesn't have anything to do with, quote, reinterpreting the Bible in light of science or, quote, reading man's ideas into Scripture. The fact that no young Earth authority argues for a planetary understanding of these other passages as they do with the flood behooves the point that they know that a proper interpretation of the Bible is based upon its context, not merely the, quote, plain, literal sense of the words as one might read them the first time that they opened the Scriptures.